Hi, welcome to c0c0n 2020. My name is Sherstobitoff. I am from McAfee Advanced Threat Research. Today we're going to be doing a talk on hitting Cobra's cyber offensive programs. So first we'll go into the agenda a little bit here. Background on hitting Cobra. We'll go into a brief 3-year operational cyber review. We'll also be looking at some of the behind-the-scenes activity for hitting Cobra's cyber offensive programs. In addition, we'll be talking to about some recent research that we had done a while back for Operation Sharpshooter, and then we'll do some key takeaways. So a little bit about hitting Cobra. So, the U.S. government here has classified hitting Cobra as the overall classification for North Korean cyber offensive programs. And in this case, the industry as a whole, particular different private sector security companies have named activity attributed to hitting Cobra in various naming conventions such as Lazarus, Blue Norov, Undariel, APT-37. In addition, when we look at the target objectives of these groups, we see that it differs between each other. Though they all have distinct and separate activity, we find that the general classification here for cyber offensive programs here still fall under the umbrella of hitting Cobra. Moving on, we'll talk now a little bit more about some of the operations, some of these notable events that we've seen over the last couple of years. In this section here, we'll talk about a 3-year cyber operational review. And so this is going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the stuff that we've seen over the course of a couple of years that have been either knowingly attributed to hitting Cobra or has been labeled by private sector security research. So from a timeline perspective here, we have a number of different cyber operations that have been going on for several years. Obviously, this is not everything that has ever been attributed to hitting Cobra, but these are some of the notable ones, particularly that we looked into. So ATR researched and documented various targeted intrusions that span the course of 2018, 2019. We also had a review of some of the most notable activities that we've seen here. So these are some of the big name events that either have made it to a publication, news, or public-facing article that pertains to some of the activity here. But some of the purpose of this talk here is to give an overview of activity, but to also show that there's a pattern of behavior that we've seen, and also recognize different distinct versions of malware that we've seen used by this group over the last several years. So first part of the operational review is going into depth more about Operation Go Secret. So Go Secret was an implant used back in 2018. Essentially, it was derived from the source code of Destover, Trojan Destover. And Trojan Destover is most infamously known for an entertainment industry attack back in 2014. Destover is closely tied to another implant known as SCAD. And essentially this is really code origins from the early development of implants pertaining to hitting Cobra from the early days. So we have back then 2017, 2018. These are kind of what you could say the early years. Further on, we see that there is a reuse of SSL TLS certificates that have appeared in previous operations. They're using these SSL certificates to sign fake TLS traffic. And even more interestingly is the reuse of compromised infrastructure from an attack that they conducted back in 2014, and it's resurfacing again in this one. Now from an implant perspective, it's interesting because it was a highly complex data recon implant that had a number of capabilities to gather machine data, user configurations, etc., and send this information back to the attacker. Also, c0c0n utilized a covert listening network using a component known as proxy SVC. So proxy SVC is essentially a component that would forward traffic to a upper level C2. This was found to be used in this attack. We won't go into too much detail about that. In addition, we've seen that the targets have been healthcare, education, energy, telco, government. Moving forward, we can see here that there's a clear lineage of implant code when we start tracking from a development perspective. We see that from the course of 2014 to 2018, there's a number of different implants that originated from early attacks, specifically back in 2014 pertaining to that entertainment industry attack. And most recently, in terms of the time frame here that we have, is the hybrid Trojan, which is using components from Destober. So the example here is using a code factory-like approach. So earlier components and different pieces are developed over the course of many years and used in different attacks, and then reappearing in other implants that are used in more modern times. And so when we try to map this out from a visual perspective of what this looks like from a linkage perspective, we see that there's a number of implants here, and each of these implants have a relationship to each other, and more specifically they have relationships to earlier Trojans, which is known as Destober. So Destober itself is using the same compromised C2 infrastructure as the 2014 attack, and we're seeing it reappear in c0c0n. So again, yes, we're talking about old attacks, but the issue, I guess the example here is code reusage. So we're seeing evolution of different codes, they're updating and modifying, but ultimately we see pieces and snippets show up in attacks that were conducted, 5 years ago. And they're still showing up today. So moving on, we have Operation Ocean Salt. So Operation Ocean Salt is essentially a targeted campaign that first appeared late May 2018, targeting Korean-speaking persons. So this was a different kind of operation that we also saw. It was using malicious documents here that were sent to victims containing subjects that were predominantly financial. We also saw that there was a consistent author of Lion. Again, we've seen that metadata contained information here that pertained to different authors, or the same author, that have occurred during that time frame. We also saw that they were using code from a APT1 Comment Crew c0c0n implant that was observed as early as the beginning of those kind of cyber operations. Again, not attributed to that threat group, but rather using code that has appeared in the underground and just building their own functionality into it. So, a little bit more about Operation Ocean Salt. Some of the implants here, it's based on c0c0n code from 2010. And essentially, the compilation of the Ocean Salt implant wouldn't have been possible unless they had direct access to original source code. What we saw here was it's designed as an implant with reverse shell capabilities. Now, it wasn't just that c0c0n was recompiled in this case here, it was the fact that they were incorporating both c0c0n code and an additional functionality built on top of that, indicating that the attacker had access to Visual Studio solution files. Further, the implant first appeared to be distributed June 1st, 2018 on a hacked website. And then further, we found that multiple debug versions contain specific strings that were not found in the initial ocean salt that gave us further insight into how this actually functioned. So moving on to the other operation here. We're seeing that Operation Bank Shot, which is another U.S. government classification for the details here, is that we see some really interesting stuff here. So it's a Turkish banking sector was hit with this malware. The U.S. government names it Bank Shot, which is also using fake TLS protocol, which was something that became quite popular and known for Lazarus-based operations. And so that was actually a fairly interesting thing that we saw there. And so what we're doing right now here is we're going to go into another operation, briefly mention this. There's been a ton of this activity here. Fake job recruitment, which is another thing that this group has highly focused on. And so what they're doing here is that they're impersonating impersonating recruiters, impersonating people that have legitimate jobs at targets that they're interested in getting access to. So for example, they would put a fake job document from a recruiter that happened to work at a major defense contractor. And then they would send this to people who might be interested in applying for a position at that company and target those. But obviously in this case here, it was another defense contractor that they also focused on. So in this case, this was a 2017 operation that we're able to finally reveal here that is containing, very interesting different targets that have occurred over a course of several months in 2017, which has very similar TTPs to something that we published about a month ago called Operation North Star. We're not going to get into that a lot here, but we're going to talk about some of the other operations moving forward. So, very quick, they set up an elaborate spear phishing campaign to target employees at major defense contractors. And they're actually involved in key defense systems that would be either used in defense of the Korean Peninsula or used directly on the Korean Peninsula. Some of these programs are basically creating decoy documents with real, legitimate job descriptions taken from credible sources. They're impersonating individuals that did work at these organizations, and they're delivering these emails to contacts within the target's organization or through other methods. So these attackers here are delivering maldocs that have a link in it that lead to additional malicious content. What's pretty interesting here is that we're seeing here that documents here targeting two defense contractors using the same API string obfuscation as the Troy 32 implants used by Lazarus Group. So we're seeing that there's actually a lot of similarities when you start breaking this down further. And classically, we'll go into a little bit more about Troy 32 and the significance of it. So real quick, this is a quick rundown summary of this spear phishing campaign. They were interested in very specific technologies. So they were targeting people who worked on those programs with fake jobs. And this was part of an impersonation campaign that was going on for a course of several months in 2017. We also see it happening now, but we're not going to get into too much detail on that one. So these implants here, again, what we've seen here, would gather basic data, typical stuff of a reconnaissance implant to establish what machine it is, who is logged in, the configuration. Also, we'd see that the command and control would communicate over fake TLS. So this is basically faking a TLS packet when in fact it's a custom protocol and sending it over port 443. Just an evasion technique to keep aware of. A couple pictures here of some of the programs here to put a face to those that they were targeting during that time frame. So in this case here, some of the, I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but some of the operations here was targeting the SOC manager, or not the SOC manager, but impersonating someone who worked in InfoSec at one of these defense contractors and sent a spear phishing email to someone working on helicopter programs indicating that they should reset their password. So the maldoc itself was essentially a password reset guide, which was something legitimate from the company, but they embedded a macro into it, which would then install an implant. So another example here of a THAAD missile system targeting. Not too much detail on that. These are some of the LinkedIn profiles that they were creating on behalf of legitimate people. So they're basically impersonating recruiters and creating short-term LinkedIn accounts to target these individuals that are interested. They would also follow those individuals that they are interested in targeting. Here's some more examples for the energy sector. Spoofing real energy sector executives. So that Troy 32 implant, as we mentioned previously, is tied to SCAD code. So the term Troy has been used consistently through hidden Cobra campaigns, especially post Dark Soul. And we see that in this case here, it used a Korean language compiler, was hosted at malicious documents at these sites. Troy 32 implant used .c2. And so on. It was using the same fake TLS as we've seen in other attacks. So now, pause for a second. We're now going to go into looking at an insider's look at North Korean cyber offensive programs. So, to look at some of the impersonation techniques, we've seen that they've become quite skillful and crafted at impersonating individuals on the internet. And so we see that they're building fake LinkedIn profiles, fake Facebook profiles. They're becoming more proficient at foreign languages and targeting people appearing to look authentic to them. Given that they're impersonating credible sources, so that's becoming more sophisticated. Even now with the newest operation that we released, Operation North Star, which is related, somewhat to this activity, given the TTPs are similar. I'd suggest you go take a look at the McAfee Labs blogs. There's a publication from about a month ago that goes into that. So again, this is just an example. One thing I do want to note is that they've used, for a number of years, hidden tracking pixels to determine the click rate of opening messages being sent from them. Some more examples here of the different emails, the different profiles that they've been impersonating here. Some more examples here of energy executives, as we covered previously. And finally, there's more here that go into some of the details. They were using email tracking links from GMAS to be able to determine how many people actually opened the email and where. So now we're going to kind of shift topics here, get into a research where we were able to get access to a command and control server and analyze some of the back end. So real quick, Sharpshooter was a targeted campaign that was also using different implants. They were targeting different, energy, nuclear, high technology. Through coordination with different international law enforcement, we were able to obtain a copy of back-end code, which gave us further insight in terms of how this activity actually related to not only hitting Cobra, but how they operated. In addition, we could effectively map it back to activity in 2017. So in this case here, we see that there's a web shell installed. This was a classic Chinese web shell here that they're used to maintain persistence. We saw that the actor also connected via ExpressVPN to hide themselves. So we also see that we can track and find additional infrastructure based on shared TLS certificates. So these shared TLS certificates allow us to be able to track other C2s and IP addresses that are also using this for authentication. And so now when we start looking at the threat activity timeline for Rising Sun, which was the implant, you can go read about Operation Sharpshooter on the McAfee Labs blog. But this kind of, again, shows to my point about tracking operations over the years in the sharing of code and the similarity of TTPs. And this Maltango chart here is another perfect example of linkage of operations from Sharpshooter to other ones based on different code sharing, TLS, infrastructure. And as you can see, it goes into numerous different directions here that show that there's relationships, even at the minute and smallest detail. So, quick analysis of what the backend components did here. We see that the backend are using several different things. They're all written in Python code. Some of the other ones were actually found to be written in ASP language. We found that the backend used a multi-layered approach to relay commands to a master server. So what's interesting about that is that it's sending and relaying commands up the channel to a hidden C2. So that means that it makes it more difficult to discover the actual infrastructure if the commands are being relayed. We found that this was custom coding. This was something that was not taken off the shelf or on the underground. This little picture here shows kind of a general flow of how all this works. Moving on. And so just, when you get a chance to actually analyze a backend C2 server, it reveals a number of interesting things. So when we dissected it, we saw that there's a number of different things that showed how it would process the results coming from the implant. So these are the different, parameters that were available: free, query, suggestion, result, set. So these were all set to do their own different functionality, as you can see here. And essentially the main menu PHP, as we saw in the previous slide here, was a command handler. So as you can see down here, there's a main menu PHP is the main command handler, which would handle commands coming in from the Rising Sun implant in the following format in this box down here. And as always, when we get a hold of these command and control code, there's a number of different other ASP pages, PHP pages that indicate, supporting functionality like deleting files, managing logs. This is some of that additional functionality. So, further, a little bit more details into mypng.png. Designed to target Middle East aerospace companies. The first stage is basically an implant to collect basic data and install further implants. Framework.php is a downloader essentially that's used to retrieve an encrypted, packed version and inject it into memory. So this little implant here, the first stage one, gets the user agent, collects basic data, and then once all of that is done, it decodes into memory the second stage, which is the main Rising Sun V2 in this case. And so typically this is kind of the process that we see a lot of it with these operations. First stage, basic implant. Second stage is then loaded directly into memory, and this is how that operation works. So this is just some additional things here showing how we're able to track other C2s that had this other kind of traffic based on an analysis of PCAPs of samples. So we can see that there's many similarities here for other ones that are out there in the wild, allowing us to backtrack and see other stuff. And so this is again just some other components, supporting ones. Vendor PHP was one to serve the Apple PNG to the downloader, which is the encrypted Rising Sun v2 Apple PNG. So last but not least, on the Rising Sun, we see all the capabilities here of all the configuration, communication, and deployment techniques. A lot to get into, but this is the general methodology here of the different capabilities and differences between the different versions that we've tracked over the years. And then we also found that there was log files indicating that the actor found that Namibian IP addresses were used to test the Rising Sun implant. And this was the last activity that we saw late 2019 that was targeting an Israeli defense company. Again, classical Rising Sun, but this time it was being delivered via WinRAR ACE vulnerability and masquerading as a sysaid product documentation. So, what have we learned here today? Cobra is a resourceful group with numerous different implants. So what we see here is that there's many things that have changed over the years that are getting better and better. You know, as we see that more intentional obfuscation of code to mask any identifying similarities, making it very hard to reverse engineer samples, which is making the analysis job harder. Second, usage of false flags to make it seem like different APT groups are also responsible. And also we see that there's consistent of code sharing patterns. We've seen that a code factory cycle has been appearing here throughout the campaigns. It's definitely clear that we've seen throughout the years that development of implants and operators are the same. We see that there's different groups responsible for conducting the attack and different groups responsible for development. And so as we see here, we've seen a shift from the classical targeting methods that we've seen post Operation Troy to cryptocurrency defense targeting and a lot of other activity that is outside of the original profile for this group. Thank you everybody for watching this virtual session here today at CoCon 2020. Thank you.